Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel session 3 that discusses the lessons learned from the COVID 19 pandemic, evolving social and economic development for sustainability. We are living in an unprecedented time in history of humanity that we face a global health crisis, coronavirus or COVID 19. We must remember that this is not only a health crisis, but it is a social, economic, and environmental crisis. The COVID 19 taught us at least one lesson that diseases, disasters, and crises do not discriminate people by race, ethnicity, gender, or socioeconomic background. It doesn't really matter if you are a developed or a developing country. When it hits everybody hard. To overcome this disease, we need to work collectively. We need collective efforts and actions to fight against the coronavirus that is targeting our health, our economy, and our security. We have to work together. We have to stand united in this fight because we are stronger together. But of course, we are not pessimistic about the future. On the contrary, we are very hopeful for the future. If we all work together, we can come out of this crisis even stronger. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce another amazing youth performance by the IFLC youth. It is entitled Smile Beneath Your Mask, a song about love and hope.
They called it COVID, I called it fear. It made me shy away, drowning my tears. I thought that hope was lost and the end was near. But when it came to pass, I knew the truth was clear. Let's stand together, love one another. My sisters and brothers, let's fight this together. Just smile beneath your mask. Just smile beneath your mask. The world is trembling, nowhere to fly. How did it come to this? We're forced to hide. But in the darkness, yeah, we can try. Our love, it shines so bright in our lives. Let's stand together, love one another. My sisters and brothers, let's fight this together. Just smile beneath your mask. Just smile beneath your mask.
This virus called Corona, it keeps on getting stronger. Like when we ran, it's making the world feel so small and colder. Thousands of people dying, so many families crying. Shout out to the doctors cause they're really trying. Hope soon there'll be a cure, but the death toll keeps getting higher. Though people are scared cause this virus spreads like a wildfire. It's time to pay attention to the health organization. So wash your hands, wear a mask, and practice social distance. Oh Lord, please end this madness and fill us with your goodness. Please give us hope and a lot of faith and your love that's endless. I put my trust in you cause I know your word is true. I'll raise my hand and praise your name cause I know I'll make it through.
We can be the cure, we can fight it through. We can change the world together, me and you. And we're gonna smile through it.
Paradise College students from Papua New Guinea. And now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Honorable Mr. Anton Mozorov, to deliver his keynote speech. Mr. Mozorov is a member of parliament from the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, and he is also a member of the State Duma Committee on International Affairs.
I'm delighted to make a keynote address on the subject ongoing communication and engagement strategies in combating the pandemic. However, before I do so, allow me on behalf of the State Duma, lower house of Russian Parliament, to bring you greetings from the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia and our people. I also thank the organizers for extending the invitation to be part of this very important event. Humankind has never faced so many global challenges as it does today. In addition to legal ones, the COVID-19 pandemic has already become a real global health and economic crisis. Russia was affected by COVID-19 as many other countries and became a part of an ongoing pandemic of this disease. There are many speculations about the origin of that disease. Some sources insist that this virus is a part of some kind of bioweapon. However, all scientific analysis found no evidence that the virus was made in a laboratory or otherwise artificially engineered. It was confirmed that the virus came to Russia on January 31, 2020, with two Chinese citizens visiting Tyumen, Siberia, and Chita, Russian Far East. Both Chineses were tested positive for the virus. As a step to prevent virus spreading, the extensive testing had started and the border with China was closed. From February 2020, all passengers arriving to Moscow by air from COVID-19, most affected countries such as China, Iran, and South Korea were met by a number of medical workers and in protective gear in charge for passengers screening. People who came from Europe before those flights were cancelled had their temperatures taken and were sent home for a mandatory 14 days quarantine. On March 2nd, 2020, the infection spread from Italy, brought some additional measures such as cancelling mass public events, closing schools, theaters, and museums, as well as shutting the international borders and declaring a non-working period which, after 2 extensions, lasted until May 11, 2020. By the end of March, the vast majority of regions and cities, including Moscow, had imposed lockdowns. However, by April 17, 2020, COVID cases had been confirmed all over the country. As a transcontinental country, Russia has the highest number of confirmed cases in Europe and the second highest in Asia after India. However, in the world we are after United States, Brazil, and India. We have over 1 million total cases, over 170,000 active cases, around 900,000 recovered, and close to 2,000 deaths. Those figures are quite impressive. However, as per 1,000 population, Russia takes the 40th place by total cases in only the 100th place by the number of deaths. Furthermore, we are the first by number of COVID tests per 1,000 population. Over 38 million coronavirus tests have been done already, and the members of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia and its member of parliaments are among the most active participants of this campaign. For example, all party headquarters has such tests twice a month. Moscow headquarters was tested yesterday. Our effective strategy to fight the pandemic included the following: strengthening the country's health care system, expansion of intensive care capacities and measures to slow down the infection. A great number of hospitals all over the country got so-called red zone wards to treat COVID-19 patients. On the very short notice, Russian army has established 18 field emergency hospitals to cover remote and most affected areas. Only mass vaccination could stop any pandemic. Therefore, the main Russian research institutes started to work on it from the very beginning. Clinical trials of coronavirus vaccine developed by the Gamaleya Research Institute were officially completed on August 1, 2020, followed by 6 other research institutes. The government of Russia has initially responded to the pandemic with preventive measures to curb the spread of coronavirus disease, which involved imposing quarantines, carrying raids on potential virus carriers, and using facial recognition to impose quarantine measures. Those measures to prevent a crisis in Russia include banning of exports of medical masks, random checks on the Moscow transport system, including Moscow subway, cancellation of large-scale public events. The Russian government has also taken measures to prevent foreign citizens from heavily affected countries from visiting Russia. Regional governments have also responded to the pandemic by imposing their own preventive measures in their local communities. On March 29, 2020, stay-at-home order for all residents was introduced in Moscow. Citizens were not allowed to leave their homes except in cases of emergency medical care and other threats to life and health. Only limited number of people from vital industries were allowed to travel to work. Moscow citizens could make purchases only in the nearest shop or pharmacy, to walk pets at a distance not exceeding 100 meters from the place of residence, as well as to take out this garbage. Socially safe distance of 1.5 meters should be kept between people. The similar self-isolation regime was imposed on Moscow region and many other regions and cities. Such limitations, frankly speaking, were not popular among our population and even caused some social tensions. Thus, testing the identification of cases, tracing contacts, isolation, these are all measures that WHO proposed and recommends, and they were in place all the time, all over in Russia. This disease affected the whole nation with no exception. On April 25, 2 cases of COVID were confirmed in State Duma, the lower chamber of the Federal Assembly, our parliament. On May 13, 2020, the chairman of the State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, announced that the 5 deputies have been infected. On May 20, the chairman of the Federal Council, the upper chamber of our parliament, Valentina Matvienko, said that 5 senators had recovered from COVID-19. Thus, over 30 deputies of our parliament in total were affected by coronavirus. The Liberal Democratic Party of Russia and its chairman Vladimir Zhirinovsky were among the first who started active campaign against COVID-19. From the very beginning, on February 19, LDPR chairman demanded that all Duma deputies should strictly comply with the rules of personal hygiene, wear protective masks and gloves, periodically and properly clean hands, maintain safe distance with others. Furthermore, Vladimir Zhirinovsky demanded to stop all handshakes and greeting hugs. As a result, being the first in those protective measures, LDPR Duma deputies have avoided getting sick by COVID-19. It was also decided to minimize the number of deputy assistants in State Duma. The general access to Duma was limited, and the majority of deputy assistants had started to work online from home. Duty trips for Duma deputies were cancelled, as well as many public gatherings planned for spring-summer 2020 were postponed, including annual international large-scale forum development of the parliamentarism. The State Duma authorities announced extra sanitization measures, limitations of quantity for parliamentary hearings and roundtables. On April 30, the Minister of Health of the Russian Federation, Mikhail Murashko, came to the State Duma to meet LDPR deputies and the party chairman Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Both sides discussed the joint efforts to contain COVID-19 spreading, how to provide people with low income with regular medical assistance and medicines. Telecommunication has already proved to be the most effective measure to minimize COVID spread. Thus, further emergency telemedicine development was the main topic of the discussion. Talking about preventive measures, LDPR chairman again pointed out the urgent necessity to wear protective masks and gloves in public. When Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin was in Duma on July 22 with his report on the cabinet recent activities, Vladimir Zhirinovsky drew attention to the fact that the Prime Minister is not wearing protective mask, giving a wrong example to all others, especially taking into consideration that Mikhail Mishustin got sick with COVID-19 last April and even was hospitalized. Other LDPR deputies also actively participated in the joint fight against COVID-19 with concentration on the importance of preventive measures. LDPR fraction deputies made several initiatives and proposals to fight COVID-19 more effectively. Among LDPR fraction initiatives are a proposal to reserve a significant share of advertising spaces in the city center and for anti-pandemic campaign to provide school children and students with protective masks free of charge, and even to start a new school year 1 month later on October 1, 2020, to minimize the risk of pandemic among our children. Being a member of State Duma Committee on International Affairs, I advocate against premature opening of the international flight to resort areas. COVID-19 came to our country from abroad, and we should not forget about it. On August 11, 2020, Russia became the first country across the globe to register a vaccine against the coronavirus infection. The vaccine was developed by the Russian Health Ministry's Gamaleya National Research Center, underwent clinical trials in July. This great achievement of Russian medical science got full support from LDPR. Vladimir Zhirinovsky proposed to reward all people involved. Sputnik vaccine proved again that Russia is one of the highest medical powers. Western countries are trying to neglect our achievements because they were looking for monopoly in vaccine production that could bring billions of super profit for their pharmaceutical giants. Russia also took part of the international project to develop and distribute a vaccine against coronavirus in a new type, one of the founders of which is the World Health Organization. Moreover, the chairman of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, was among the first injected with the first in the world registered coronavirus vaccine. He also called to vaccinate all the party's 300,000 members as volunteers at the first test stage, and we will have started our registration for this forthcoming vaccination. Yes, our country had some achievements in that fight against COVID-19 pandemic. However, we could not rest until the threat could be eliminated completely. With reference to LDPR's chairman's opinion, ongoing pandemic revealed weak points and mistakes of Russia's country healthcare policy system. Therefore, the forthcoming parliamentary session should be fully concentrated on required corrective measures. We fully support the UN position that the COVID-19 pandemic is more than a health crisis. It is an economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a security crisis, and a human rights crisis as well. Coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, and whole of the world approach driven by compassion and solidarity. On September 11, 2020, the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution for a comprehensive and coordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which became an important contribution to enhancing global solidarity and give more possibility for the international cooperation. Finally, no country in the world will be able to tackle COVID-19 on its own. The main strategy should be to act collectively so that nobody can be left behind. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for panel session 3, Mr. J.J. Green, who is the National Security Correspondent at WTOP Radio. He reports daily on international security, intelligence, foreign policy, terrorism, and cyber developments. He hosts the weekly podcast Target USA, which examines the threats facing the USA. He also hosts the weekly broadcast program The Hunt, conducting in-depth interviews with experts. Mr. Green, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, and thank you to the Journalists and Writers Foundation for the opportunity to participate in this important event. I would especially like to express my appreciation to Mr. Mehmet Kilic and Ms. Cemre Ulker and Ms. Ezra Aydin for the opportunity to address this distinguished audience and moderate this panel, and for all of the assistance they've given me and helped me with to get prepared for this. Almost 1 million people have died from COVID-19, about 5,000 a day. There are 1,440 minutes in a day. There are 86,400 seconds in a day. During the next 5 minutes or so, many people will lose their lives to COVID-19. The most important takeaway for me from this panel is going to be that every second counts. So the information we share today can save many lives. As a journalist who's traveled to foreign war zones many times in the last 15 years, I've seen the toll that pandemics, war, famine, and political chaos can take on humanity. But this year, 2020, is the first time that I've lived through this at home. Just yesterday, the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 reached 200,000, more than any place in the world. And I've seen friends and family die needlessly because of bad information or no information in one of the most developed countries in the world. It's made me much more committed to working tirelessly to help bring an end to this pandemic and trying to prevent another from happening. As racial tension, COVID-19, ongoing conflicts, and political chaos test the cohesiveness of this planet, it's time for me, for us, to reach deeper. Our world faces unprecedented challenges that day by day, degree by degree, undermine our ability to perform the vital work of truth-seeking and responsible and inclusive reporting. Those challenges are existential threats to our industry, our constituents, and our world. We must work to defeat those challenges. Those challenges include distortion of facts and efforts to discredit and harm journalists. People are dying in the US and around the world because they're confused about what is true and what is not about COVID 19. People are dying because they can't get access to the care that they need. People are dying because they've lost their jobs, family members to this disease, and people are dying because they've lost hope. We have work to do. This work includes in exposing the lies, the threats to our safety and security, promoting understanding of them, and helping to create mechanisms to defeat them. The very fact that we are meeting virtually this year to continue this important work carries with it both the gravity of the situation the world faces, being physically cut off from moving freely and engaging in necessary business and governance and security and health matters, means the reality that we can still get most of what needs to be done anyway. But it comes at a cost that takes more time, more patience, and real ingenuity. Many of us have had to figure out how to do things we've forgotten how to do. Many of us have forgotten how to get along without jumping into a car or a train or a bus to go someplace. Many of us have forgotten how to sit with just our thoughts and our imaginations. COVID-19 has reminded me of all of those things. And I don't say this to try to make this horrific pandemic to be a good thing. I say it to remind us that there are people on this planet during the best of times who stay home for months at a time. There are people on this planet that get by without jumping in a car, on a train, or a bus to go someplace. And there are people on this planet who just sit with their thoughts and their imaginations every day. We who had so much before COVID-19 have been reminded of the plight of those who live every day without so many of the things that we take for granted each day. And now we know that we must work harder to make sure that they too have every opportunity to succeed that we have. As you've heard, 2020 is a strategic turning point for the global community, and the UNGA Conference 2020 is in the process of strengthening the response of the international community and facilitating collaboration between the UN member states, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society organizations toward a common objective of creating peaceful and inclusive societies where everyone is entitled to undeniable rights without discrimination. There are many facets of this work, and today we will get started addressing 4 critical areas: responding to the global emergencies and best practices from COVID-19, the new era of online engagement, refugees' rights during the pandemic, and COVID-19 and the right to life prisons. So without further ado, let us get started with our first panelist. And our first panelist is Jeff Schlegelmilch. He's the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute. He was the manager for the international and non-healthcare business sector for the Yale New Haven System Center for Emergency Preparedness and Disaster Response. Mr. Schlegelmilch led a study to determine the requirements for national operational epidemiological, easy for me to say, modeling process, developing and delivering a national training program focused on evacuation and sheltering of people with medical dependencies, and developing new models for community resilience with a focus on children. He's also a FEMA certified master exercise practitioner and has been in a leadership role on numerous discussion and operations-based exercises, including one of the largest municipal bioterrorism response exercises ever conducted. Mr. Schlegelmilch will begin by talking to us about responding to global emergencies and best practices for COVID-19. Mr. Schlegelmilch, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Green, for that introduction, as well as for your thoughts, and thank you to the Journalist and Writers Foundation for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to share a couple of slides here. So I'm just going to kind of use them to help ground the conversation going through this. So to start out, here are some recent graphics. And I think one of the key things, and that Mr. Green shared as well too, is that this is a very uneven experience with COVID-19. And it is going to continue to be very uneven as well as persistent. This is driven by a lot of things, from ecological conditions to the natural spread of the disease to population density and movement, seasonal effects that aren't fully understood, as well as within communities themselves. This is some data that some various colleagues in New York City put together. My colleagues at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness pulled it together in this report, looking at how marginalized communities that are historically disenfranchised, are bearing a disproportionate burden of this disease. So the experience in New York is that you have an outsized number of cases among African Americans, among Hispanic and Latino populations. These are folks who are historically bearing the brunt of chronic diseases due to structural inequities and structural racism in a lot of policies. And where people live, it predisposes people to outsized effects of disasters, and in this case, infectious diseases. But also amplifying that is it also, these populations were also those who are more likely to be essential workers and have to go to work when many other people could stay home or work remotely and things like that. So there's a social aspect to disease, a social aspect to response that is very inconvenient, but may very well be one of the most important things. Another thing I want to talk about with response is that there's this false narrative out there that you either have to shut down the economy or keep it going, and that you have to do the opposite with the disease, that somehow fighting the disease is bad for the economy. And I want to say that that's actually a false choice. That is not true. And here's some various data. If you look in the top left, it's kind of tough to see, but the US is in the light blue, and a lot of other European countries are the other colors. But essentially what it's showing is that, you know, in comparative countries in Europe, you saw the lockdowns much more aggressively and much more uniformly. And temporarily, it depressed economic activity, and then it bounced back faster than the US. And I know folks are saying that out there we're starting to see a need for more lockdowns. That's the way pandemics work. They come in waves. What's important is that when you get through one wave, what do you do immediately afterwards to keep that transmission low? And how do you prepare for the inevitability of another wave coming down the road? And in this case, controlling disease spread creates options for the economy. It means you can start opening some things up, start traveling with some restrictions, with certain things in place, and for individuals to take responsibility on that. The other piece that you see on the bottom graph is also looking at what are the signals that governments are sending. Are they sending signals that we're in this for the long haul, we're putting together these packages? So in this case, you can see improvements on some of the various stock indices when there was the proposal to the EU on a recovery fund. This is just an example. In the US, we're still sort of mired in debate over a follow-up to COVID-19 funding, with a lot of the benefits running out. So these signals are also very, very important for more certainty for industries, for business, and ultimately for individuals. Some of the indirect effects that we've seen with COVID-19, and I think that's an important thing, and I appreciated Mr. Green's comments in the beginning of the panel about how, you know, it's not just about the illness, it's about the loneliness, it's about not being able to work, being stuck at home, that this has cascading effects across civil society. We see it in statistics for abuse, we see it in loss of traction for other public health threats, increases in STDs, loss of traction in malaria prevention or whatever. And we're also seeing, unfortunately, we've also continued to see hints of, you know, this further rise in nationalistic tendencies. We're seeing it in the US, you're seeing it throughout the world. You know, we're seeing politicians pushing dubious science, trying to say that improperly tested vaccines are ready to go, and it's a conspiracy that they're not. And this is just unfortunately undermining broader efforts for COVID-19 response. But there is a silver lining. There are some best practices. I like these pictures that sort of show just the visual. It has almost a spiritual effect in terms of seeing what it could be like if we look at climate change, if we look at the impact we're having on our society, and look at what are ways, some things we need to go back to the way they were before, but not everything. We have new tools in remote collaboration and education that are connecting people like never before. Telemedicine, e-commerce, sort of reaching some sectors and reaching some people. It's not a replacement for in-person, never will be, but it does open new avenues of connection. We're seeing investments in healthier buildings in terms of HVAC, cleanliness, the quality of air purification, just better environments. Professional education, we're all learning to be better online collaborators, as well as we've seen a lot of incredible work across sectors, particularly in the biopharmaceutical sectors, in terms of sharing technologies and sharing platforms. And also this re-looking at, domestic and regional production. How much do we really want to move towards the fragility of global just-in-time supply chains? In some cases, that's great. It saves a lot of money. And others, it obviously creates a vulnerability. And when we talk about disasters more broadly, these are two graphics from UNDRR looking at really all disasters across, natural hazards, disasters and natural hazards from about 30 years, 98 to 2017. And this also reinforces, we're used to looking at disasters a certain way, but it's not the whole story. So on the left, you see what is the total cost of disasters, and the vast majority of the countries identified are high income or upper middle income countries, because there's a lot of expensive stuff in the way of disasters. But when you look at what is actually that impact to the overall economy, what is the ability to absorb that, and what is the ratio to that, you look at the same data viewed through a different lens. In this case, what is that cost relative to GDP, to the output of a country's economy? And what you're seeing here is the vast majority are low income or lower middle income countries. They don't throw out the big numbers like the $50 billion disaster, but at the same time, these dollars, this proportion of GDP may be having an outsized effect on that economy. And, we talk about these in dollars and cents or euros or pounds or whatever currency you choose, but at the end of the day, that's just something that we're able to measure. What it really represents is loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, and the human element of these disasters. And I think it's important that we really try to wrap our head around all of it. This graphic may be tough to read, but it's essentially a colleague at another conference focused on urban resilience presented it, and now I've stolen it with citation and presented everywhere else, because it shows all these different definitions of resilience. And when we're talking about resilience and disasters, whether it's to COVID-19, whether it's to weather-related disasters, there's a political component, there's a component of the built environment, of the social environment, of the ecology of where you're living, and all of these various aspects of society come together to formulate resilience. There is no single answer. There is no single person responsible, but it's distributed across all of civil society and requires us to work towards that common goal. Otherwise, you risk focusing all your efforts on the built environment only to fracture the social cohesion and the social connectedness of certain groups. And weather-related disasters, they keep happening. We're seeing our share in the U.S. right now of wildfires, tropical storms, coastal storms, tornadoes, derechos, a sort of weather phenomenon we're seeing more and more of. And this is just to show, in a nutshell, those trends are going up in the U.S. and across the world. And as we're seeing these disasters impact more and more, the way that we've responded, the way that we finance them is continuing to change. There's some interesting look at sort of who pays for it. And in a lot of wealthier countries, you're seeing a lot more insurance take over, sort of spreading the financial risk across more and more places, and across the private sector, sort of increasing access to that recovery. But you're not seeing that so much in developing areas and lower and middle income countries, where that actually kind of assistance could be more important. Given, as we saw in the graphic earlier, with the impact to the proportion of gross domestic product. So here's a slide. A number of colleagues have done a bit of research on this. I've had the pleasure of connecting several times with Daniel Aldrich, who studied this in a lot of settings. But actually, there's emerging evidence that these connections matter more than ever, that these inequalities, it's not just a humanitarian issue, it's not just a sort of an ideal state of things, that it's a huge predictor of who lives and who dies, of who recovers and who doesn't. And fostering these connections within a community, neighbors helping neighbors, leads to less death and better health and mental health outcomes. And vertical connections with the government, tend to speed up the recovery process. And we see this in the US, we see it elsewhere in the world. And it's one of these things that as the evidence builds, it's one of those things we know with our hearts, and now we're starting to have the evidence and demonstrating it with our heads and more granularity. So with that, I would say, uncertainty is here to stay. We're in a place of uncertainty. We don't know when the pandemic will end. We don't know what the effectiveness of a vaccine will be. We don't know a lot of things. This uncertainty, this is what the coming century looks like. And that building adaptive systems are going to be more successful in the face of uncertainty than planning for one specific event or one specific scenario. As we're seeing with climate change, the past can provide hints at what we're going to see, but it is not a good predictor of what's going to happen, particularly with the increase in extreme weather events. And with that, there's no single indicator of resilience. We need to pull together all of the various aspects of community, and managing uncertainty and adapting to these situations, as I mentioned, is going to be more important than ever in the coming century. So with that, I know we have some other phenomenal panelists, and I look forward to jumping back in and being part of the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Mr. Slagle-Milch, that was absolutely phenomenal. Listening to you talk about these very important things. Specifically, you're talking about the false narrative and, talking about things that we've created essentially as stopgaps that may become permanent. And those are all things that I'm very interested to talk to you some more about that. And we will do that as our program proceeds today. Moving on to our second panelist, Mr. Shiv Vikram Khemka is the Vice Chairman of the Sun Group Global. He's the Executive Chairman of the Global Education and Leadership Foundation in India. And he's going to talk to us about the new era of online engagement, evolving economic development and private sector. Mr. Khemka, as I've mentioned, is the Vice Chairman of Sun Group. He's both operating and investment, working with operating and investment companies active in areas including private equity, renewable energy, oil and gas, high technology, gold mining, and real estate. And Shiv has served on the board of overseers of the Wharton School for over a decade and is currently on the board of the Lauder Institute and the Center for Advanced Studies of India at the University of Pennsylvania. He also serves on Yale's President's Council on International Activities, the Asia Society's Policy Institute's Global Council, and the Advisory Board of Stanford University's Philanthropy. So without further ado, Mr. Khemka will talk to us about the new era of online engagement, evolving economic development and private sector. Sir, the floor is now yours. And just while we're waiting for him to get on with us, get on board here, just a little bit more about what he's been doing. He is also, as I mentioned, a member of the President's Leadership Council at Yale, but he's also working with Brown on the advisory board of the School of Oriental and African Studies and the board of the Judges Institute at Cambridge University. And let's see, I think he's still working to get on with us. I will say, as we proceed through this today, think about your questions. Think about what's on your mind as we look at this. This is a really interesting situation that we're facing as a world, because every single country in the world is facing the very same enemy at the same time. So in order to deal with that enemy, we're going to have to work together. And that's very odd when you're talking about war. We are at war with this COVID-19 enemy, but this is going to require some type of international cooperation that we really have never seen before we can defeat it. At least that's just my thought. So let's check to see if Mr. Khemka is on yet. Okay. I don't think he is on yet. Let's move on to our next panelist while we sort this out and get back to him in just a moment, or in a few moments, I should say. Instead, what we will do is move on to our next panelist, who's Basma Alawi. Basma Alawi, of the Florida Immigrant Coalition. She's a state refugee organizer in the U.S. And refugee rights during the pandemic is what she's going to speak about. Basma Alawi was born and raised in Baghdad, and Ms. Alawi came to the U.S. with her husband as a refugee in 2010, leaving behind her career as an engineer with the Ministry of Oil within the government of Iraq. And as a refugee and activist, her stories and activism have been featured numerous times in the media. Most recently, she was nominated to be one of the Athena 40 women in the world who are leading change, and was the recipient of the 2019 One Jacks Humanitarian Award. She was also elected the Florida delegate for the UNHCR Refugee Congress and is a board member of the USA Hello organization, formerly Refugee Center Online, and numerous other nonprofits. Currently, she's the state refugee organizer with the Florida Immigrant Coalition and resides in Jacksonville. Again, Basma Alawi will talk to us about refugee rights during the pandemic. Ms. Alawi, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Green. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Thank you so much for having me here. Just a short introduction. I am honored to share and be in the same space with powerful panelists. I also want to thank Mr. Sell, a friend and a community leader in Florida, who invited me to speak at this great panel. I am Basma Alawi, a former refugee who turned to be a refugee advocate within the first year I got resettled in the state of Florida 10 years ago. Soon later, became a Florida refugee delegate to speak on behalf of all the refugees in the state of Florida. And almost 3 years ago, I entered the human rights field as Florida refugee organizer with We Are All America and housed with the Florida Immigrant Coalition. And just to give a really short introduction about this amazing organization who I am part of, starting with the Refugee Congress, which was founded in 2011 on the 60th anniversary of the Refugee Convention to convene resettled refugees from all 50 states. Today, Refugee Congress is the only national organization in the US led by former refugees like me to advocate for refugees. Refugee Congress members in all 50 states advocate with their elected officials for welcoming communities. And We Are All America, which is I am the Florida refugee organizer with We Are All America in the state of Florida, was founded in 2017 in response to the US cutting its resettlement program to the lowest level ever during the worst international refugee crisis in modern history. We Are All America affirms our historical role as a refugee protection. Works to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcome and protect those seeking freedom, safety, and refuge in the United States. We organize people across religion and culture differences to build inclusive community where we all belong. And to go back to our subject, to speak about what's happening in the global now with refugees and give a snapshot about refugees and COVID-19. Today, nearly 80 million people forcibly displaced, more than 1% of the world population. 26 million of them are refugees, more than 4 million asylum seekers globally. Nearly 46 million are internally displaced. Nearly 90% of refugees live in developing and low-income countries with the fastest growing infection rates. What makes refugees more unique during COVID, there is a lot of lacks that we already have, but during COVID, these kind of needs are increased, starting from lack of medical supplies and therapeutic, lack of accurate information about how to protect themselves. Vaccine nationalism may limit access for our communities, and also this kind of population often not included in country-specific pandemic reopen plans. Refugees are impacted not just by COVID, but also by the fear that is causing around the world. As this quote from report by Refugees International shows, the very concept of refuge is under assault. In response to the pandemic, it is estimated that 164 countries across the globe have limited or cut off access to asylum. In some cases, governments have clearly weaponized public health concerns to advance nativist political agenda, and the United States is a case in point. Some examples of organizations who have been responding globally to the crisis of COVID, starting with World Health Organization and UNHCR and the UN Refugee Agency, partnering to strengthen public health services to millions of forcibly displaced people. UNHCR launched a global $255 million appeal to lessen the impact of COVID-19 outbreaks within refugee communities, limited entry into and exit from refugee camps, and efforts to allow refugee professionals within foreign credential to serve as essential health workers. And that's happened in many places like United Kingdom, Peru, and Argentina. To go and visit how is refugees and COVID and all the struggle that's happening for the refugees in the US. So the US has resettled about 3 million refugees since 1980, the signing of the Refugee Act. From the 1980 of 2000 until 2016, the average number of yearly refugee arrival to the US was 95,000. This year cap, it was supposed to be 18,000. We were supposed to bring 18,000 refugees in 2020, but up to date, we have received 9,772, and of course, part of it because of COVID. In this slide, we tried to really bring in what kind of impact refugees have faces and asylees have faces during COVID. Starting from physical health, we have higher risk of getting COVID-19 due to the overcrowded housing, underlying health condition, lack of access to healthcare, being essential workers. You may also heard about the outbreaks of the COVID in meat packing plants that many refugees have been affected. When we go to jobs and income, Refugees International found that over 60% of employed refugees work in sectors highly impacted by the pandemic. And refugees have high rates of small business ownership, and small businesses have been deeply affected. Going back to resettled and family reunification, we have decline in refugee admission, means thousands of families in the US are still waiting to reunite with their loved ones. And of course, we should not forget mental health, because refugees have been traumatized by quarantines. And I have written before in the beginning, I think in May, how the quarantine have bringing memories to refugees like me, or even in times of refugees who left war. Other crises in the US have been happening, like the uprising in the response to police violence against Black people, hurricanes and wildfires, and COVID together with these crises are severely increasing stress for refugees. How is the US responding, and what kind of challenging our community have been facing? The government responding, starting with support financially with different kind of act, like the CARE Act, state and local relief funds, eviction moratoriums, and expanding testing availability. But what kind of challenges our community is facing, even though with these great responses? The government relief, even though it's available, but not to all families, so the resources are limited. Refugees face barriers to access resources because of language barrier and fear of accessing these resources. Still challenging with testing and treatment, increased in xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. And lastly, closing the borders. Even though many organizations and community members have been responding, refugees are also responding to all of this. These are my colleagues who work with me alongside around the country. We have many projects have been done around the country that led by former refugees, starting with partnering with local nonprofits. You see George in the picture, partnered with the New York Cares to distribute masks and healthcare information, to emergency response like Dauda in Louisiana with his organization brought humanitarian aid to St. Charles City after the storm, and many other amazing projects that have been led by refugees. And again, we should not forget essential workers, doctors volunteering at COVID testing sites, many refugees and immigrants serving as healthcare workers, teachers, service workers, farm workers, and more. The COVID pandemic has reminded us that we are all interconnected and interdependent. We must use this time to come together, embrace our communities, and work to build a better future. Refugee Congress stands ready and willing. Let's work together to fight against discrimination and for justice. And this is a quote from one of our Refugee Congress delegates. So what we have been learning. There are many lessons that we have been learning, but also there are more to learn later. But for now, these are some of the things that I was able to highlight. One, refugees face unique vulnerabilities and challenges in public health crisis. Refugees are also assets during the public health crisis. Refugees have solution when refugees are allowed to practice their profession through improved routes to certification and license. With their overseas credential, communities benefit from these skills. Expanding economic inclusion benefits everyone. Assistance to refugees enter the labor market and serves in essential worker role as doctor, nurses, caregivers, scientists, cleaners, and more. Benefits everyone. Digital and technology access can be a matter of life and death. Language access needs to expand beyond majority languages spoken. Refugees need assistance navigating the system to access available support and fundings. Investing in former refugees, leadership, and organizing on the ground to essential to producing inclusive policies and practices. And again, and lastly, story sharing and the voices of refugees are important to change making. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Basma. That was very educational in many ways. And there's one thing that you mentioned regarding the concept of the weaponization of this horrible disease against refugees in terms of their movement. And you said the concept of refuge is under assault, and that is certainly something that needs to be fixed. We will come back to that in our question and answer session. Next, I'd like to introduce and thank you, Basma, for that. I'd like to introduce our next panelist as we move on into this process. And I'd like to introduce you to Barak Heilamaz, and he's with Human Rights Solidarity UK, and COVID-19 and the right to life in prison. Turkey's case is what he's going to discuss. Mr. Heilamaz graduated from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands with a degree in European law, and he earned his master's degree from the University College of London. He focuses his practice within the field of data protection and intermediary liability, fintech compliance, as well as human rights law. His recent works in the field of human rights have been published by several respectful institutions, including the Harvard Human Rights Journal and the Warsaw University Law Review. So without further ado, Mr. Heilamaz, welcome, and the floor is yours.
So again, thank you so much, Mr. Green, and all panelists for their remarkable thoughts on the impact of the COVID to several aspects of the life. And also thank you for the Journalists and Writers Foundation for organizing this event today. So as experienced, the spread and subsequently the impact of the virus is beyond walls. However, in my session, I will take your attention to the situation within the walls, with a specific focus on the reactions of Turkish authorities to the pandemic in prisons. After the announcement of COVID-19 as a global pandemic, the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture, CPT, immediately produced a set of principles for member states to follow in their approach to people who are deprived from their liberty. As one of the signatory countries of the Council's European Convention of Human Rights, Turkey is one of the addressees of these principles. When we analyze the key recommendations within the principles, member states are required to improve the conditions of prisons to the level of international health and safety standards. They are also required to ensure that prisoners have the access to medical care, medical equipment, medical staff at any time. Further, they are required to ensure that any restrictive measure can only be taken if it's necessary and proportionate. Also, they are required to ensure that absolute nature of Article 3 ECHR, which is a prohibition of torture and ill treatment, shouldn't be violated. So there is no derogation, limitation, or excuse acceptable if a taken measure lead to infringement of this prohibition. Last but not least, member states, they are required to use alternative means of deprivation, such as early release, probation, house arrest, if applicable. So the rationale behind this principle is very clear. Any inadequate level of health or safety measures can rapidly lead to situations.
Mr. Halamaz, forgive me for interrupting. You're doing a brilliant job here, but there are some papers that are, I think, on top of your microphone, and they are making a horrible noise that's drowning you out. So could you please move those papers away from your machine or your microphone? And please continue, sir.
No worries. So after analyzing these principles, it is clear that these principles have one target, which is any inadequate level of healthcare and safety measures can rapidly lead to situations falling within the scope of Article 3 prohibition, namely inhuman and degrading treatment. So the question arises whether the Turkish criminal legal system and also Turkish authorities have achieved to implement these principles enshrined under ECHR as a response to combat with the global pandemic. In early spring, we start to hear COVID cases in prisons throughout the relatives of the detainees who expressed the severe situation in Twitter. However, the first official statement about the spread of the pandemic in prison was made on April 14th, and accordingly, there were 17 confirmed cases and 3 deaths at the time. Another statement came on May 22nd, where it was reported that a total of 82 confirmed cases only in Silivri prison, which is just one prison, and one prisoner had died. However, both opposition parties and also human rights organizations have raised an issue that government has not been transparent about the number of COVID cases in and outside the prison. The People's Democratic Party, for instance, produced a report by also gathering the data from the families and lawyers of prisoners. And in this report, it illustrates that number of cases and death rates in prison is much higher than the official statements, and health and safety measures have not been taken properly. For instance, the report underlines several problems. Wards and corridors, they are not cleaned regularly. Masks, gloves are not regularly distributed in prison. Most of the prisons are suffering from the overcrowded population that also accelerates the spread of the virus. The food service in canteens, for instance, they were stopped, and the quality of food sharply declined, which directly weakened the immune system of prisoners, hence increased their chance of being affected by the virus. Also, when prisoners, they file a complaint in regard to COVID, instead of enabling medical staff access, authorities automatically gave them a medicine called Peliconil, which is actually a medication used to combat with malaria. So temporary solutions are taken. Also, the state website enables to check recent medical situation of the prisoners. However, inmates' relatives and lawyers report that the medicine is providing a misleading information that inmates. It reveals that inmates are taking medical support. However, when they are speaking with the inmates, they understand that these are just temperature checked by prison guardians. So, without a doubt, the report illustrates that the fact that Turkey has been practicing a potential violation under Article 3 ECHR by failing to comply with its positive obligation to prevent inhumane and degrading treatment. On the other hand, on April 14, 2020, the government enacted a highly contested amnesty law that enabled the release of around 900 prisoners. It is contested because of several reasons. So first, it categorically excludes all political prisoners facing terrorism-related charges from its scope, which has been the terrorism-related charge that we know is like it's always interpreted broadly by the authorities. Secondly, it only applies to those whose sentence were finalized. Hence, release doesn't include whose trial proceedings at pending. So the amnesty law has been strongly criticized because of its unfair and discriminatory nature, which contradict with Article 2 as well as Article 14 of ECHR. This categorical blanket exclusion prevents the release of an additional 50,000 prisoners, including journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers, activists, and all other political prisoners arrested or convicted with terrorism-related charges. Can Dündar, which is a journalist in an exile, described this unfairness of the bill in Washington Post by stating that a bureaucrat who accepted bribes could be released, while the journalist who reports on the bribery would remain imprisoned. On the other hand, the bill is problematic under Article 6 of ECHR, which is a fair trial provision, because detainees whose case is pending cannot benefit from the amnesty law, and they cannot finalize their proceeding due to either the closure or limited operation of the judiciary. From February to mid-June, Turkish courts had been suspended due to the pandemic and no trials were held. Although the courts have started to operate after mid-June, it is restricted due to the health and safety reasons. So there are limited amount of trials for thousands of delayed proceedings. As a result of this backlog in judiciary, detainees cannot benefit from amnesty law and continuously being deprived from their liberty. In other words, detention, which is supposed to be a legal precaution, has turned into a punishment at the moment in Turkey. So, in a nutshell, when we analyze the reactions of Turkish government to cope with the impact of COVID-19 with a specific focus on prisons, we can detect a couple of potential ECHR infringements. So first, under Article 3 ECHR, Turkish authorities may be found failing to take necessary measures to ensure the right to health of prisoners. Secondly, the enacted amnesty law immensely contradict with Article 2 in conjunction with Article 14 due to its discriminatory nature as a result of the blanket exclusion of political prisoners. Finally, the enacted amnesty law and the backlog in court proceeding deprive detainees' right to fair trial, which is protected under Article 6 of the ECHR. So thank you so much for listening to me, and again thank you for the Journalist and Writer Foundation to organize this event and promote the human rights advocacy throughout the world. I wish all participants and audience safe and healthy days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barak. You said some important things about the food supply and the medical access when it comes to inmates, and I know a little something about this because there's one individual who's been in a prison in Russia since the late part of 2018, and I do recall when this whole COVID thing started happening, he was given an onion and told that onion, the vegetable or whatever you call an onion, whatever group it's in, would protect him from COVID-19, and obviously we know that's not true, but those are things that need to be addressed, and hopefully we'll have time to ask you a couple of questions about that. We have our next panelist with us now, and it is such a great pleasure now to introduce again Mr. Kemke. Mr. Kemke, as I've mentioned and before to you, is the Vice Chairman of Sun Group Global. He's the Executive Chairman of the Global Education and Leadership Foundation in India. And he's going to talk about the new era of online engagement, evolving economic development and private sector. Mr. Kemke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. I'd like to thank the Journalists and Writers Foundation for inviting me to be here. And it's a very important moment in history. And I feel that the private sector is going through unprecedented times with the issue of jobs. It is a new era of online engagement, but I think it has considerable risks and some opportunities as well. Most people are working remotely. Over 50% of those in the working population, it is estimated, are working remotely now. And some recent surveys showed that 70% of those people are actually not complaining and believe their efficiency may be going up. Of course, there are about 30% who are unhappy with that in terms of the working population. The other side of it is, of course, many jobs have been lost and many more jobs could be lost depending on how long this recession goes on. And I think that the toll on mental health, on interpersonal relationships, and I think the excess burden on women in terms of dealing with the work from home model are all things that are going to have significant long-term impacts unless we address them sooner rather than later. In terms of education, which our foundation is very focused on, more than 1.2 billion young people are out of school. That's a huge number on the planet that people are now accessing e-learning, e-education is booming. But the reality is that only 59% of the world's population has access to internet. 41% still doesn't have access to the internet. So there's a huge divide, a digital divide that again could have significant repercussions over the next few years unless we are able to deal with that in some thoughtful ways. For us, looking at the world today, the issue that really worries us is that of jobs. How are we going to create enough jobs to deal with the trifecta of effects that are all coming together? The COVID impact on the economy, slowing economies, people losing jobs, people going into the model of a gig economy with very little job stability. And that loss of jobs is also being exacerbated by technology. Technology is also coming in at the same time, digitalization, artificial intelligence, and many other things, which will create many jobs, but are also destroying many jobs at the same time. And I think it's going to be a big challenge for the people that lose their jobs to learn and adapt and reskill for the new economy that is being developed, particularly those mid-career professionals that will find it hard to retool and restructure their knowledge appropriately and fast enough. The world population is growing, and if you take the next decade, we estimate that we need to create 1 billion more jobs. Again, how are those jobs going to be created? The government is pumping, all governments are pumping significant capital into the economy to try and keep growth going, to try and protect their economies, to try and fund public construction projects and other projects. And that will have an effect. But the question is, will it have enough of an effect to counter the significant loss of jobs that we foresee on the planet? COVID itself, we estimate, has caused a loss of about 500 million jobs worldwide. And if you look at the need for another 1 billion jobs on top of that, the creation of new jobs as well, how many of these jobs will come back? There's a real gap there. And we believe that one of the only ways to deal with that gap is actually to encourage entrepreneurship globally, to create a new mindset amongst young people and older people on the planet that the age of stable corporate employment may be moving to an age of an entrepreneurial mindset where everyone starts to think like an entrepreneur. Everyone starts to encourage collaboration and entrepreneurial sort of cooperation, and to work together and to not waste resources globally, but to actually team up and to think about best practices in different parts of the world. And rather than trying to just create something on the basis of very little knowledge, to share the knowledge and to try and keep improving on the models that exist out there, whether it is in pure enterprise, venture enterprise, or even in social enterprises. Job creation in countries like India, we need to create 1.3 million jobs a month for the next 30 years. That's a huge challenge. And on top of that, now we have COVID and the slowing down of the economy, borders being closed in many parts of the world. And although governments are valiantly trying to create economic growth through infusions of monetary support into the economy, we believe that actually the key is going to be entrepreneurial energy being unleashed, entrepreneurs working together. We are working with many other foundations to create something called the Entrepreneurship Sports Generation. It's about bringing entrepreneurs together around the world and making entrepreneurship something that's not seen as an elitist province, but something that everyone can participate in. The democratization of entrepreneurship, I would call it, rather like sports is a very democratic architecture around the world. Everyone feels that they can watch, they can play, they can be involved in the sporting architecture around the world, whether it's football, FIFA, the Olympics. We think entrepreneurship should be seen in the same light, where everyone can play, everyone can be involved, and actually by that collaborative, competitive spirit, we can actually try and restart and give some kind of a fillip to the economy globally to create more jobs. Because that to me is the biggest concern in the next 5 to 10 years. And we believe that all of us need to hold hands together to do the best we can to create jobs on the planet. As we all know, entrepreneurs create jobs at twice the rate of corporations. Small and medium-sized enterprises employ the vast majority of people on the planet. Over 90% of the people on the planet are employed by small entrepreneurs. And so I think that we need to do the best we can to find a way not only to encourage global entrepreneurship, get government support behind that, but also to really educate our young people to think with a new mindset for entrepreneurship and an entrepreneurial mindset in whatever they do. I think the age of stable jobs, may be redefining itself. And I think that's what worries us and keeps us up at night. I once again thank everyone very much for giving me the chance to speak. And I look forward to engaging in the question and answer session. Thank you very much, Mr. Green.
Mr. Khemka, thank you. And I'm glad you were able to join us, and you had some very interesting and disturbing points that we need to address. 41% of people on the planet with internet that's not good, and that needs to be addressed. So we'll get into that. I'd like the rest of the panelists to please join us. I see you are now, and I'd like to, there are a few questions I'd like to get into, but first, I'll just ask one from myself and then go out to the other questions. All of you, starting with you, Jeff, you mentioned something regarding the uncertainty that we're facing, but you also, all of you, talked about how everything that we've known, essentially, has been changed in some way by COVID-19. So I'm wondering if each of you could just briefly announce or just briefly address what you think that's taken place during COVID-19 that might be a good thing to keep. And I'll start with you, Basma.
This is actually a question that I was discussing the other day with some of the people who I have met during COVID. Actually, it's really important that things that we didn't know about, that we can really create a bigger global community from home. Yes, we have been working locally with refugees and immigrants community. We have been locally working with many organizations, even nationwide. But I felt during COVID and during the quarantine, we were able to make more connection, bring in more stories, and nothing limits us because here we are. We can be all together with less expense of flight and staying overnight. And for me, like as a refugee, I see all this, even though it's a great connection, but sometimes it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of money on a 30-minute conference that you need to attend. So to me, it's there's a lot of saving, it's happening, but in the same time, a lot of connecting with people outside your community.
Okay, let's get Jeff. You were the first person to throw that out there, so let's get back to you on that. You talked about this uncertainty, and you also talked about everything that's been done, pretty much being a stopgap, but some of it should be kept. What are your thoughts on what we keep?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, our ability to deal with uncertainty and imprecise information, right? Everything from, there's a lot that's still not known about COVID-19, but yet we know enough to know that it's a good idea to do it, like wearing a mask. What is the exact benefit of that? What is the exact but we know that by layering these different interventions, we have a pathway forward, we have different options, and that's really the key to managing uncertainty. When you manage certainty, you come up with checklists and you come up with procedures and you follow them. When you are managing uncertainty, you're trying to create options that you can exercise in the future as more information becomes available, but also working backwards. What information do you really need? So, there's information all over the place on how long COVID-19 lasts on surfaces. Is it a day? Is it 2 hours? Is it 3 days? Depending on the surface, depending on the conditions. But what are you going to do differently? Are you going to stop washing your hands if that number is 2 days instead of 3? You're still going to wipe things down. You're still going to wash your hands. So I think that this acclimation to uncertainty is something that's going to benefit us for a lot of different aspects of the coming century, and the different kinds of disasters, including biological, but many others that we're going to continue to face.
Yeah, thanks. Barak, what are your thoughts?
So, more or less, as a response to both questions, actually, on the one hand, there are lots of imprecise information that we are dealing with. Even in Turkey's example, it's made by the authorities. But on the other hand, as Basma stated, there are also several options to connect with each other, such as Twitter journalism is one of the information that before preparing my documents for this presentation, I had also opportunity to talk with one relatives of the inmates through the Twitter. So that's also one of the, if there's any positive aspect of the global pandemic, is also we are more connected, that even my for instance grandma, she's using the Twitter right now to get the information that she needs.
Okay, Mr. Kemka.
I think that just to reiterate, what Barak just said, I think we're not going to go back to the age where we're not used to and being comfortable working online. So I think that's a big thing, where we are so comfortable now working online, working with people all over the world, as Basma said, connecting with everyone and learning online. I think that's a new world we've all entered, every age, every generation. And I think that's something we're going to keep. But I do think that for me, the greatest thing is learning to be, stationary, to be with oneself, to be with one's close ones, to take the time, as you said, Mr. Green, right at the beginning, that it's an opportunity that we shouldn't waste. It's an opportunity to learn really what it means to be with ourselves and to value things that perhaps we didn't value as much as we should have in the days when we took everything for granted.
Yeah, I can certainly say that talking with the four of you today has really turned a page in my life. I know a lot about what happens in the world, but the problem is I'm moving so fast, I just don't have the opportunity to digest the important nuggets of each element of it. And I think our people that have joined this seminar today are really benefiting from this, because we've got some pretty good questions here. And here's one. This question comes from Sasha Butler. And she says, intercultural and global competence is at the core of the United Nations focus on global citizenship, education for an interconnected and interdependent global society. The question is, what do you believe are the short-term and long-term implications of this COVID-19 emerging neo-nationalist mindset on youth and young adults? And I'll start with you on this particular question, Jeff.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, one of the most useful pieces of information that I've seen was actually a roundup of the behavioral sciences and looking at both all the way down to the individual as well as to the cultural level on just sort of different ways of approaching this. On cultures with more of a collective identity, it's going to be easier to ask for sacrifices to individual freedoms, whereas for a greater good, whereas that's going to be a lot harder in other societies. And I think we're seeing that, you know, it's really an inflection point on all of this. Pandemics really exploit divisions in our politics and divisions in our societies, and unfortunately we're seeing that take place. But they also bring out the best in us. I think it's important to recognize both. This is, I guess, kind of a lame answer, but I'll give it anyway. I think on the one hand, we need to call out nationalism. We need to call out these very damaging behaviors when we see them, but we also need to celebrate what's going well. We need to celebrate where communities are coming together and leading the way. I appreciated Mr. Kemke's remark as well too about the entrepreneurial spirit. It's this this entrepreneurial attitude from communities that are actually going to shine a light on how we approach this globally. And so I'm grateful actually for all my colleagues here today who have helped shine a light on a lot of the good things that are going on, as well as a lot of the challenges we face.
Yeah, and Mr. Kemke, you mentioned this horrible number of people that aren't able to access the internet, and we know that young people are probably impacted more so than others because a lot of learning takes place online now. Kids need internet to do homework. What are your thoughts on that particular question about how this, the long-term and short-term impacts of this neo-nationalist mindset and just the downside of what the impact it's having on youth and young adults?
I think it's a very real problem and a real worry. You know, for us to become insular and to think just about our small world, I think is very dangerous in a world which faces really global challenges. Climate change is a global challenge. Refugee crisis is a global challenge. I think there are many, many global challenges. The pandemic is a global challenge. And if we retreat into a sort of towers of protectionism, I think we're going to face a much harder time adapting and fixing and dealing with the world that's going to emerge for the next generation. So I think we need to do everything to create a sense of, you know, one humankind, global citizenship. I'm a great believer in global citizenship and think that we need to understand that no man is an island. We're all connected. We're all together. We need to all uplift the world together. You know, a planet where 8% of the world has 83